In the dim archives of a forgotten university library in rural Virginia, a young historian named Eleanor Carter sifted through yellowed papers, her fingers trembling as she uncovered a brittle envelope sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Inside lay a single page scrawled in frantic ink. "The sweat of the damned birthed our salvation. Forgive me, for the cost was a soul." The date read 1796, and the signature belonged to Dr. Elias Hawthorne, a man whose name had faded into obscurity. But what chilled Elena to her core was the footnote, scribbled almost illegibly, "Prototype secured from the fields of Blackthorn Plantation, no records to follow." As she pieced together the fragments, a horrifying truth emerged. Not just a scientific breakthrough, but a hidden atrocity, buried under layers of official silence, where the labor of the enslaved wasn't just exploited for cotton, but for something far more insidious: the dawn of modern medicine. Before we go further, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Blackthorn Plantation sprawled across the misty lowlands of antebellum Virginia like a shadow cast by forgotten sins. It was the late 18th century, a time when the air hung heavy with the scent of tobacco leaves and unyielding earth, and the crack of overseers' whips echoed like thunder over the rows of workers bent under the sun. Elias Hawthorne wasn't born to this world of soil and subjugation. He was a scholar from Philadelphia, drawn south by whispers of enlightenment and opportunity. Educated in the nascent sciences of Europe, he arrived at Blackthorn in 1794, not as a planter, but as a guest of the estate's owner, Jeremiah Blackthorn, a man whose wealth was built on the backs of hundreds. Hawthorne's mission was cloaked in the guise of agricultural innovation, improving yields through rational methods, as he called them in his letters home. But beneath that veneer lay a darker ambition: to conquer the invisible killers that plagued the colonies, the fevers and pox that claimed lives without mercy. The plantation itself was a microcosm of the era's cruelties, a vast operation where families were torn apart at auction blocks, their lives reduced to ledgers of labor and output. Enslaved men, women, and children toiled from dawn until the stars pierced the sky, their sweat soaking the soil that fed the Blackthorn fortune. Jeremiah ruled with an iron pact, and whispered among the quarters as the family legacy, a system of forced pairings designed to ensure a steady supply of workers, binding bloodlines in chains of inheritance that mocked any notion of freedom. It was here, amid this orchestrated despair, that Hawthorne set up his makeshift laboratory in a converted barn at the edge of the fields. Glass vials and copper instruments gleamed unnaturally against the rough-hewn walls, a stark contrast to the mud-churned paths outside. He spoke of progress to anyone who would listen, claiming his experiments would benefit all, but the enslaved saw only another layer of intrusion, their bodies poked and prodded under the guise of observation. The first signs of the secret surfaced subtly, like ripples in a stagnant pond. In the summer of 1795, a fever swept through the quarters, felling dozens. Official records from the county clerk's office, those sparse pages that survived, note it as a seasonal ailment, with no mention of the bodies buried hastily in unmarked graves behind the smokehouse. But Hawthorne's private journals, hidden away and only recently digitized in a 2023 archival project, reveal a different tale. He wrote of harvesting essences from the afflicted, drawing samples from the sweat and fluids of those who suffered most acutely. One entry stands out, dated July 12th. "The resilience in their veins is unparalleled. The trials they endure forge something unbreakable." Udrae. It was a clinical detachment that masked the horror, subjects selected not by chance, but by the plantation's brutal hierarchy, those deemed expendable in the forced programs that Jeremiah enforced with quiet ferocity. As the fever waned, Hawthorne's work intensified. He confided in a single letter to a colleague back north, intercepted and sealed away in family attics until Elena's discovery. A stupid error in dilution, my own folly, mingled the extract with a common variola strain. Yet from this mishap a prototype emerges, one that might shield the vulnerable. Variola, the smallpox scourge that ravaged continents. Hawthorne had stumbled upon an early form of vaccination centuries before Jenner's cowpox fame, but at what price? The extract wasn't from animals or willing donors. It came from the very sweat of an enslaved woman named Lyra, whose name appears only in faint marginalia. Lyra, mother to 3, had been part of the plantation's unspoken breeding arrangements, her body a vessel for labor and legacy. When the fever struck, she was among the first to fall ill, her symptoms documented in Hawthorne's notes with detached precision. Elevated temperature, lesions, a vitality that defied expectation. The silence that followed was profound, a deliberate veil woven by those in power. Jeremiah Blackthorne, ever the pragmatist, ensured no whispers escaped the estate's borders. Overseers were paid extra to enforce quiet, and the few who dared speak of the doctor's trials vanished into rumors of flight or punishment. Community records from nearby towns, church ledgers, tax rolls omit Blackthorne's darker dealings, attributing any irregularities to natural causes. It was a complicity born of fear and shared interest. Local elites turned blind eyes, their own fortunes intertwined with the plantation's output. Decades passed, and the Civil War came and went, leaving Blackthorne in ruins, its fields overgrown and its secrets sinking into the earth like forgotten seeds. Lyra's fate? Erased. No gravestone, no obituary, just a line in a burned ledger. Lost to illness, 1796. Yet the weight of it lingered in the human stories that survived orally, passed down in hushed tones among descendants. Elena traced one such thread to a great-great-granddaughter in a small Virginia town, who recalled her grandmother's tales of the healer who took without giving, a figure who promised cures, but delivered only more chains. These fragments painted a portrait of shattered lives, families divided by the very programs meant to sustain them, children born into a cycle of abuse, masked as necessity. The emotional toll was a quiet devastation, etched in the lines of faces that carried unspoken grief across generations. As Elena delved deeper, the hypotheses began to form. Was Hawthorne's mistake truly accidental, or a calculated risk on lives deemed lesser? Rumors persisted of a pact between the Doctor and Jeremiah, an exchange of silence for shared glory, with the enslaved as unwitting pawns. Osadas, or rather, skeletal remains unearthed in a well during a 2018 restoration of the old barn site, bore traces of pox scars, hinting at experimental aftermaths. But the true revelation waited in the archives, where Hawthorne's confession tied it all together. His prototype, smuggled north and refined into what would influence early vaccine trials, born not from benevolence but from exploitation. In this opening to the shadows of Blackthorne, we see the first threads of a tragedy that spanned centuries, the sweat of one woman's suffering twisted into a cornerstone of science, while her story faded into oblivion. The investigation continues, unearthing what history tried to bury. The mist clung to the fields of Blackthorne like a shroud, muting the cries that never fully escaped the quarters. It was the fall of 1795, and Elias Hawthorne's laboratory had become a forbidden sanctum, its door barred against the prying eyes of the overseers. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid tang of chemicals and the faint underlying bitterness of human endurance. Hawthorne, with his wire-rimmed spectacles perched on an aquiline nose, moved like a ghost among his apparatus, his mind a whirlwind of equations and ethical shadows he dared not name. He had come to Virginia chasing the promise of discovery, but the plantation's rhythms, the relentless cycle of planting, harvesting, and control, had warped his intentions into something unrecognizable. What began as a study of soil fertility had veered into the uncharted territories of the body, where the enslaved provided not just labor, but raw material for his ambitions. Lyra's days blurred into one another under the weight of expectation. She had been brought to Blackthorn a decade earlier, her memories of a distant coastal life reduced to fragments. The salt spray of the Atlantic, the warmth of a mother's embrace before the chains. Now, in her late 20s, she was ensnared in the estate's unspoken compact, a program of pairings orchestrated by Jeremiah Blackthorn to perpetuate his workforce. It was framed as providence, a way to build strong lines for the fields, but it stripped away choice, turning bodies into vessels for an inheritance of bondage. Lyra's own children, 2 boys and a girl, their faces etched with the quiet defiance of the young, were proof of that legacy, their births marked not with celebration, but with tallies in the overseer's book. When the fever descended that summer, it found her weakened, her frame already taxed by the dual burdens of toil and enforced motherhood. She collapsed amid the tobacco rows, her skin hot as embers, visions blurring the line between delirium and despair. Hawthorne observed her from afar at first, his notebook filling with annotations that read like a detached elegy. "Subject exhibits remarkable fortitude," he wrote on August 3rd. "Temperature rising, yet vitality persists amid the onslaught." He approached under the cover of night, when the quarters fell silent, save for the murmur of prayers whispered to ancestral spirits. With Jeremiah's tacit approval, a nod exchanged over brandy in the big house, Hawthorne extracted what he needed, a vial of sweat from her brow, mingled with the subtle fluids of her affliction. It was a violation cloaked in science, her pain distilled into droplets that he believed held the key to immunity. In his journals, later unearthed in a dusty trunk during Elena Carter's archival dive in 2024, he confessed the pivotal folly, a miscalculation in his preparations, where a weakened variola sample contaminated the extract. "A stupid blunder," he scrawled, the words trembling on the page. Yet, from this chaos, attenuation occurs, a shield forged in unintended fire. The implications rippled outward, unseen but profound. As Lyra lingered on the edge of recovery, her symptoms waning under the crude care of the quarter's healers, herbal poultices and chants that Hawthorne dismissed as superstition, he tested his prototype on a small scale. A few field hands, selected for their robust constitutions in the plantation's cruel calculus, received the inoculation. No records detail their reactions. The ledgers from Blackthorn, preserved only partially after a suspicious fire in 1802, speak merely of minor indispositions among the workers. But oral histories gathered by Elena from descendants in the 2020s paint a starker picture. Swollen arms, feverish nights, and a lingering distrust that bound the community tighter in shared secrecy. One elder, speaking in a recorded interview from a Virginia community center, recalled her great-grandmother's words. "The doctor came with his needles, promising health, but took our strength and gave back shadows." Jeremiah Blackthorn, the architect of this veiled empire, watched it all with the calculated gaze of a man who had long ago bartered his conscience for prosperity. Tall and gaunt, with eyes like polished flint, he had inherited the plantation from a father who preached divine right over human chattel. The pact with Hawthorne was never formalized, but it hummed in the air between them. Silence for innovation, exploitation for progress. Blackthorn enforced it through subtle threats, a reduction in rations for the uncooperative, or the spectre of separation for families already fractured by the breeding mandates. He burned what documents might incriminate, ensuring that the county's official annals, those dry tomes Elena pored over, reflected only bountiful harvests and orderly operations. The fevers come and go. One surviving entry notes blandly, as does the labor that sustains us. This complicity extended beyond the estate's fences, weaving into the fabric of the surrounding community. Local physicians, beholden to the Blackthorns for trade and favor, turned away from rumors of unusual ailments. Church elders, whose pews were filled with plantation kin, preached submission as God's will, silencing any murmurs of unrest. It was a collective amnesia, born of the era's entrenched hierarchies, where the elite's sins were shielded by layers of denial. Decades later, after emancipation's fragile dawn, the plantation's remnants scattered like ash. Freed families migrating north, carrying tales that twisted into myth, while the land reverted to quiet decay. Blackthorn himself died in 1812, his will donating portions of the estate to scientific pursuits, a gesture that Elena uncovered as a veiled attempt to launder his legacy. Yet the human cost echoed through time, a melancholy undercurrent in the stories that survived. Lyra's children grew amid the whispers, their mother's ordeal becoming a cautionary thread in family lore, the one who burned bright and faded. One son, named Josiah, escaped during the war, his descendants preserving fragments. A locket with a lock of her hair, tales of her songs that defied the night. Elena met one such heir in 2023, a woman named Mira, whose eyes held the weight of unspoken inheritance. "We carried the scars without names," Mira said, her voice steady but laced with sorrow. "They took her essence for their cures, but left us the emptiness." As Elena connected these dots, the hypotheses sharpened. Had Hawthorne's mistake been the spark, or merely the excuse for deeper predations? The ossuary findings from that 2018 well, bones bearing faint inoculation marks, unearthed during a routine survey, suggested a pattern of trials hidden in plain sight. Letters from Hawthorne to Northern contacts, redacted but pieced together in digital scans, hinted at shipments of field-derived serums that influenced early medical circles. The prototype, refined and passed along anonymous channels, laid groundwork for vaccines that would save millions. Yet its origin remained a buried truth, a monument to forgotten resilience. In the quiet unraveling of Blackthorn's secrets, we glimpse the tragedy's deepening folds, innovation stained by suffering, memory clinging to the edges of oblivion. The shadows lengthen, pulling us toward revelations that history long concealed. The winter of 1795 settled over Blackthorn Plantation like a pall, frosting the tobacco fields in brittle white and turning the quarters into huddled fortresses against the chill. Elias Hawthorne's laboratory, once a haven of flickering lantern light, now felt like a tomb, its air heavy with the residue of ambition and regret. He paced the dirt floor, his boots leaving faint imprints in the frost-kissed earth. As he pondered the fragile vials lining his workbench, each containing a sliver of what he had wrought from chaos. The stupid mistake, as he termed it in his encrypted notes, had not been a mere accident of the hand, but a convergence of haste and hubris. In diluting the variola strain for what he intended as a soil preservative, a misguided bid to combat crop blights, he had inadvertently attenuated it through Lyra's resilient essence. Her sweat, harvested in those fevered moments, had acted as an unforeseen catalyst, binding the pathogen in a way that promised protection rather than peril. Yet as Hawthorne stared at the glowing liquid, a shadow of doubt crept in. At what unseen cost had this miracle been forged? Lyra, meanwhile, navigated the aftermath in the dim confines of her cabin, her body a map of lingering aches that no herbal remedy could fully erase. The fever had receded, leaving her skin mottled with faint scars, like whispers etched by an unforgiving hand. She moved through her days with a quiet ferocity, tending the young ones who clustered around her like fragile shoots in barren soil. The plantation's enforced pairings had bound her to a man named Theo, another soul claimed from the auctions, their union a calculated stitch in Jeremiah Blackthorn's tapestry of control. It was a system whispered about in the dead of night, where women like Lyra were matched not for affection, but for the vigor they could impart to future laborers, bodies compelled into roles that blurred the line between survival and subjugation. Theo's hands, calloused from the plough, offered what solace they could in stolen moments, but the weight of Hawthorne's intrusions hung between them, unspoken yet palpable. "The doctor's gaze lingers too long," Theo murmured once. As they shared a meagre supper of cornbread and greens, Lyra only nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire, where embers danced like the spirits she invoked in secret prayers for release. Hawthorne's trials expanded in the shadowed months that followed, a clandestine operation veiled by the plantation's isolation. He selected a handful more from the quarters, those whose endurance mirrored Lyra's, marked by the same unyielding spirit that the overseers both prized and punished. Under the guise of routine health checks, mandated by Jeremiah to maintain productivity, Hawthorne administered his prototype, a prick of the lancet, a swab of the attenuated fluid, and then watchful waiting as the subjects carried on with their burdens. No dramatic collapses ensued. Instead, a subtle shift. Fewer fevers in the spring planting, bodies that seemed to shrug off the ailments that felled others. Hawthorne documented it all in ciphered ledgers, symbols that Eleanor Carter would later decode with the aid of a 2024 linguistic algorithm, revealing entries like, "The essence endures, transforming peril into safeguard, yet the donors bear the unseen toll." It was a eureka wrapped in ethical fog, the doctor's northern ideals clashing against the South's brutal pragmatism. He justified it in private missives, arguing that the greater good demanded sacrifice, but the tremor in his script betrayed the fracture within. Jeremiah Blackthorne, ever the sentinel of his domain, deepened the pact that bound them. In the oak-paneled study of the big house, where portraits of stern ancestors glared from the walls, he and Hawthorne sealed their alliance over maps of the estate and sketches of viral pathways. "Your work stays here," Jeremiah said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, "and in return the fields yield more than ever." It was a bargain of mutual concealment. Hawthorne's discoveries funneled northward through anonymous couriers disguised as agricultural treatises, while Blackthorne quashed any ripples of unrest. Overseers patrolled with renewed vigilance, their whips a deterrent to questions, and those who faltered under the inoculations, experiencing what Hawthorne called transitory discomforts, were isolated, their absences chalked up to laziness in the sparse logs. The community beyond the gates, a scattering of farms and hamlets in rural Virginia, absorbed the silence like mist into the ground. Local merchants traded cotton without inquiry, and the circuit-riding preacher invoked providence over the peculiar health of Blackthorne's hands, attributing it to divine favor rather than human meddling. This veil of complicity extended its tendrils into the very records meant to preserve truth. County archives from the era, yellowed and incomplete, make no mention of Hawthorne's presence beyond a cursory note of his arrival as a consultant. Tax assessments praise the plantation's robust output, ignoring the human machinery that powered it. It was a systemic erasure, where elites like Jeremiah leveraged influence to burn or bury incriminating pages, ensuring that history's ledger balanced in their favor. Oral threads, however, wove a counter-narrative, carried by those who escaped or endured. In the 2020s, Elena interviewed a lineage of Lyra's descendants in a modest Virginia church basement. their voices weaving tales of the marked ones, forebears who bore faint scars on their arms, shunned for the strangeness of their survival. One woman, in her 80s, clutched a faded photograph of a stern matriarch. She said the healer's gift came with chains we couldn't see. It saved some, but broke the trust forever. The emotional undercurrents ran deep, a melancholy river carving through generations. Families like Lyra's, already fractured by the plantation's mandates, found new fissures in the secrecy. Children grew wary of the doctor's shadow, their play hushed when lanterns flickered at the barn's edge. Theo's quiet rebellion, slipping extra rations to the afflicted, earned him a public admonishment, his back bearing the stripes that spoke of the era's unyielding code. Lyra herself, in the fragments Elena pieced from a survivor's memoir discovered in 2022, emerges as a figure of resilient sorrow, humming lullabies laced with coded warnings, her spirit unbowed even as her body was commandeered. The weight of it all, a mother's endurance twisted into scientific lore, left descendants adrift, grappling with an inheritance of strength shadowed by loss. As Elena's research pressed on, the hypotheses multiplied like vines overtaking the ruins. Was the prototype success a fluke, or the result of deliberate selection from the quarter's most vital souls? Skeletal remains from that 2018 excavation, analyzed in a Charlottesville lab, showed not just pox remnants, but micro-traces of foreign compounds in the bones, early indicators of experimental serums. Hawthorne's letters, smuggled and now digitized, alluded to field innovations that reached Philadelphia's medical societies by 1797, seeding ideas that echoed in later vaccine lore. Yet the core remained buried. Lyra's sweat, her unwitting gift, the stupid mistake that birthed progress from pain. In these deepening layers of Blackthorn's hidden chronicle, the tragedy sharpens. Exploitation cloaked as enlightenment, silence as the true chain. The path to revelation winds onward, through archives and ancestors, toward truths long interred. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Spring unfurled over Blackthorn Plantation in 1796 like a reluctant confession. The tobacco fields greening with tentative life, while shadows of the previous winter lingered in the hollows of the earth. Elias Hawthorne's laboratory hummed with a feverish urgency now, the air inside thick with the scent of distilled essences and the faint metallic tang of lancets sterilized over open flames. He had refined his prototype through sleepless iterations. The stupid mistake evolving from blunder to blueprint in his mind, an attenuated variola strain, stabilized by the very resilience he had harvested from Lyra and others. Vials multiplied on his shelves, each a fragile testament to the boundaries he had crossed, sent northward in corked bottles, disguised as herbal remedies. Yet as the sun climbed higher, casting long rays through the barn's slatted walls, Hawthorne felt the weight of his isolation pressing in. The pact with Jeremiah Blackthorn held firm, but cracks were forming, subtle as the first fissures in thawing soil. Lyra returned to the fields with a guarded vigilance, her steps measured along the furrows where the earth still bore the imprint of last season's toil. The scars from her illness had faded to pale whispers on her skin, but the deeper marks, the intrusions of Hawthorne's work, lingered in her wary glances toward the barn. She had borne another child in the quiet months, a daughter whose cries echoed the enforced rhythms of the plantation's legacy, another link in the chain of pairings that Jeremiah dictated with cold precision. These arrangements, whispered as necessary for the estate's endurance, stripped away autonomy, compelling unions that served the fields more than the heart. Theo, her steadfast companion through it all, worked the plough lines nearby, his presence a silent anchor amid the overseer's watchful eyes. They spoke little of the doctor's visits now, but in the hush of evening, Lyra's hands would trace patterns in the dirt, symbols from old coastal tales, invocations for protection that no ledger could capture. Hawthorne's expanded trials rippled through the quarters like an undercurrent. Selecting more souls for his veiled experiments, he chose those whose vitality shone through the grind, a young man named Silas, whose endurance under the sun mirrored Lyra's, an elder woman, Mira, whose herbal knowledge he co-opted under pretense of collaboration. The inoculations were administered in the dim light of cabins or the cover of tool sheds, a quick prick followed by murmured assurances of health. "For the good of all," Hawthorne would say, his voice laced with the conviction of a man convincing himself. But the responses varied. Some shrugged off subsequent ailments with unnatural ease, while others endured what he noted as residual echoes, nights of unrest and limbs heavy as lead. In his ciphered journals, decoded by Eleanor Carter during a late-night session in a Virginia State Archive in 2024, he grappled with the ethics. The essence they provide is a gift unasked, yet it shields against the reaper's scythe. Forgive the method, for the end redeems. Jeremiah Blackthorne patrolled his domain with renewed fervor, his silhouette a stark outline against the horizon as he rode the fences on his grey mare. The pact had deepened into a shadowed alliance, with Hawthorne's successes promising not just personal acclaim, but tangible gains for the plantation. Fewer lost workdays to illness meant higher yields, bolstering the Blackthorne name among regional elites. In exchange, Jeremiah enforced an iron silence, dismissing whispers of the healer's curse with swift reprimands. One overseer, too loose-tongued after a jug of cider, vanished into the night, his absence noted only as desertion in the ledgers. The big house, with its columned facade hiding rooms of polished oak and hidden compartments, became a repository for the few documents Hawthorne dared not burn. Sketches of viral attenuations, lists of contributors rendered anonymous. Jeremiah's complicity was absolute, rooted in a family tradition of control that viewed the enslaved as extensions of the land itself, their bodies tools in an unending harvest. The surrounding community, a patchwork of hamlets and modest farms in the Virginia lowlands, absorbed this secrecy like rain into clay. Local landowners, tied by trade in cotton and tobacco, averted their eyes from Blackthorne's peculiarities, their own estates mirroring the same veiled cruelties. A circuit judge, passing through on quarterly rounds, recorded only the plantation's prosperity in his notes, omitting tales carried by freed wanderers of marked arms and shadowed cures. Church gatherings, held in whitewashed meeting houses, preached resilience as divine ordinance, quelling any unrest with hymns that drowned out questions. It was a web of mutual protection, where elites shielded one another from scrutiny, ensuring that official histories, those sparse county rolls Elena sifted through, painted Blackthorne as a beacon of order amid the era's chaos. Yet beneath this facade, the human drama unfolded in quiet devastation. Families in the quarters navigated the trial's aftermath with a stoic grief, bonds strained by the unseen burdens. Silas, after his inoculation, found his strength waning during long hours, confiding to Theo in hushed tones of dreams haunted by needles and fire. Mira, the elder, passed her knowledge to the young ones in coded songs, warning of outsiders who took without return. Lyra's daughter, swaddled against her chest as she hoed the rows, became a symbol of persistence amid erasure, her tiny form a reminder of lives compelled into continuation. Oral legacies, fragile as spider silk, wove through these moments, tales of ancestors who survived the fire gift, their scars badges of a resilience born from necessity. Elena traced one such thread to a 2023 oral history project, where a descendant named Elias, ironically named for the doctor, recalled his grandmother's words, "They drew our fire to light their world, but left us in the cold. We carried it still, in blood and bone. Elena's own journey mirrored this persistence, her days blurring in the dim glow of microfilm readers and digital scans. In a breakthrough moment at a Richmond Historical Society in early 2025, she uncovered a smuggled letter from Hawthorne to a Philadelphia apothecary, its edges frayed but ink intact. The prototype, derived from field trials, attenuates with unparalleled efficacy, a stupid error's silver lining. It hinted at the serum's quiet dissemination, influencing early medical texts without attribution. Hypotheses swirled in her notes. Had Jeremiah's influence extended to suppressing broader inquiries, or was the silence a broader institutional failing? The 2018 well excavation yielded more clues, bones with attenuated pox traces, suggesting a hidden graveyard of trial subjects, their stories interred with them. This era at Blackthorn marked a pivot in the tragedy, where exploitation's fruits began to bear outward, seeding progress while roots delved deeper into forgotten soil. The emotional toll mounted, a melancholy tide eroding the barriers of denial as descendants and seekers like Elena pressed against the veil. The revelations hovered, tantalizingly close, in the archive's depths and the echoes of oral memory, truths that history had tried but failed to fully silence. Summer's heat descended on Blackthorn Plantation in 1796 like an unrelenting interrogator, baking the earth until cracks spiderwebbed the tobacco rows and the air shimmered with unspoken tensions. Elias Hawthorne's laboratory had transformed into a crucible of secrecy, its walls stained with the residue of ceaseless distillation, where vials of the prototype serum caught the light like forbidden jewels. The doctor's hands, once steady with scholarly poise, now trembled faintly as he calibrated his mixtures, haunted by the realization that his stupid mistake had birthed not just a scientific anomaly, but a moral precipice. The attenuated variola, stabilized through the harvested essences of the quarter's resilient souls, promised a barrier against the pox's ravages, yet each success etched deeper the chasm between his ideals and the plantation's grim reality. Shipments continued northward, bundled in innocuous crates labeled as botanical extracts, slipping past watchful eyes to seed whispers of innovation in distant medical circles. Lyra toiled under the merciless sun, her hoe biting into the soil with rhythmic determination even as the weight of her latest burdens pressed upon her. The enforced pairings of Blackthorn's legacy had yielded another life, a son whose wide eyes mirrored the quiet watchfulness she had cultivated over years of subjugation. These arrangements, dictated by Jeremiah's unyielding vision of perpetual labor, wove families into a web of compulsion, where affection was a luxury overshadowed by necessity. Theo worked the adjacent furrow, his broad shoulders glistening with sweat, casting occasional glances her way, glances laden with the shared knowledge of Hawthorne's lingering shadow. The inoculations had spread subtly through their circle, a hidden current that spared some from the seasonal fevers but left others adrift in unease. Lyra felt it in her bones, a faint echo of that fevered harvest, as if part of her vitality had been siphoned away, leaving a hollow readiness for whatever trials the fields or the doctor might demand next. Hawthorne's experiments reached a precarious zenith that season, venturing beyond the quarters into riskier waters. He began correlating his serums with the plantation's broader operations, hypothesizing that the essences could enhance not just immunity, but endurance against the land's tolls. In the sweltering afternoons, when overseers dozed in the shade, he gathered small groups in the barn's dim interior, Lyra among them, selected for her proven resilience. "A further safeguard," he murmured, his lancet glinting as it pricked the skin, introducing refined variants of the prototype. The air grew thick with held breaths. the subject's eyes reflecting a mix of resignation and defiance. Hawthorne noted their responses with frantic precision, Silas reporting a surge of clarity amid the heat, Mira enduring without complaint, but whispering later of dreams where her blood flowed like rivers of fire. Yet not all outcomes aligned with his visions. One young woman, part of the mandated pairings, faltered after the procedure, her steps unsteady as she returned to the rows, her absence from labor noted only as indisposition in the ledgers. Jeremiah Blackthorne observed this escalation from the veranda of the big house, his pipe smoke curling like the tendrils of control he wielded so deftly. The pact with Hawthorne had evolved into a symbiotic fortress, each man bolstering the other's domain. Scientific yields for agricultural dominance, silence for mutual elevation. Jeremiah's methods grew more insidious, quelling ripples of discontent with calculated precision. Rations withheld from the questioning, families threatened with division to enforce compliance. He confided in no one but his private correspondence. Fragments Elena Carter unearthed in a sealed family trunk during a 2025 estate auction revealed a steely rationale. The doctor's work ensures our line endures as surely as the fields do. Butes. The plantation's isolation amplified this veil, the surrounding woodlands a natural barrier against outsiders, while local alliances solidified the complicity. Merchants in nearby towns accepted Blackthorne's cotton without probing the faint scars on the hands that baled it, and the county surveyor, on his annual rounds, praised the estate's vitality, blind to the human machinery humming beneath. This institutional shroud extended like roots into the soil of history, where official records bent to the will of the powerful. The Virginia Gazettes of the era, digitized in sprawling online repositories that Elena navigated with weary determination, chronicled bountiful harvests and moral upliftings, omitting the shadowed trials at Blackthorne. It was a deliberate forgetting. Elites like Jeremiah leveraging kinship and coin to excise inconvenient truths, leaving gaps that yawned like open graves. Yet memory persisted in the oral tapestries of the enslaved, threads passed in lullabies and midnight gatherings, tales of the essence thieves who drew strength from the weary, promising protection but delivering isolation. Elena captured one such echo in a 2024 interview with a descendant in a rural Virginia library, the woman's voice cracking as she described inherited stories. "My great-gran said the doctor's gift was a double-edged blade. It warded off death, but carved away pieces of the soul we couldn't reclaim." The human drama intensified amid these veiled operations, a tragic undercurrent of fractured bonds and unspoken sorrows. Lyra's family, already woven tight by the plantation's mandates, felt the strain deepen. Her children, playing in the scant shade of the cabins, mimicked the adults' wariness, their games hushed when Hawthorne's silhouette appeared on the horizon. Cleo's quiet acts of defiance, sharing poultices brewed from wild roots, drew the overseer's lash, his punishment a public spectacle that echoed through the quarters like a warning knell. In the quiet hours, Lyra confided fragments to Mira, the elder's wisdom a balm against the encroaching despair. "We endure because we must, but the fire they take burns in us still." These moments painted a portrait of resilience, shadowed by melancholy, lives compelled into survival, while their essences fueled distant dreams of progress. Elena's pursuit mirrored this persistence, her nights consumed by cross-referencing Hawthorne's ciphers against plantation manifests in the dim archives of a Charlottesville repository. A pivotal discovery came in mid-2025. An overlooked affidavit from a former overseer tucked in a forgotten court file, alluding to unusual medical interventions at Blackthorne that preserved the stock through providence. It fueled her hypotheses. Had the prototype's refinements involved broader coercion, turning the quarters into unwitting incubators. The 2018 excavation's bones, re-examined under modern spectrometry, revealed attenuated viral markers in multiple remains, suggesting a pattern of trials that spanned the season. Hawthorne's own confessions, pieced from marginalia, hinted at the growing unease. The mistake's child grows strong, but at the expense of innocence I cannot repay. As summer waned, the tensions at Blackthorn coiled tighter. A storm brewing in the humid air, experiments pushing boundaries, silences straining under the weight of secrets. The tragedy's folds deepened, innovation's light casting long shadows over lives reduced to footnotes, while Elena's unearthing promised a tardy justice, pulling the buried truths toward the surface one fragile thread at a time. Autumn's chill crept into Blackthorn Plantation in 1796 like a thief in the night, stripping the tobacco leaves to brittle husks and turning the fields into a labyrinth of fading green and encroaching brown. Elias Hawthorne's laboratory, once a forge of frantic creation, now echoed with the hollow resonance of culmination. Its shelves lined with rows of perfected vials that gleamed like captured stars in the lantern's glow. The doctor's stupid mistake had matured into a refined arsenal, the attenuated serum, born from Lyra's sweat and the essences of her kin, now a potent shield against the invisible scourges that haunted the age. He dispatched the final consignments northward under the cover of harvest wagons, each bottle wrapped in layers of deception, destined for shadowy exchanges in Philadelphia's apothecary dens. Yet as the winds whispered through the barn's eaves, Hawthorne confronted the precipice. His discovery, poised to reshape medicine, rested on foundations of exploitation that no equation could justify. Sleepless nights found him poring over his ciphers, the ink blurring under the strain of unspoken remorse. Lyra moved through the cooling days with a weary grace, her hands calloused from the harvest's demands, gathering the last of the crop under skies heavy with impending frost. The plantation's enforced programs had woven another thread into her life, a fragile infant cradled against her as she worked, a testament to the unyielding cycle of compulsion that Jeremiah Blackthorn orchestrated with detached authority. These pairings, veiled as stewardship of the estate's future, bound souls in chains of obligation, where survival hinged on yielding to the land's insatiable hunger. Theo labored at her side, his frame leaner from the season's tolls, their shared glances a silent language of endurance amid the overseer's distant patrols. The inoculation's legacy lingered in subtle ways, a resilience that spared the quarters from the autumn agues sweeping neighboring farms, but at the cost of a deepening wariness. Lyra felt it in the quiet moments, a faint disconnection, as if Hawthorne's extractions had drawn not just her vitality, but fragments of her spirit, leaving echoes that hummed in her dreams like distant drums. Hawthorne's final phase of trials unfolded in the harvest's shadowed hours, a clandestine crescendo that tested the serum's limits on those the plantation deemed most vital. He convened small assemblies in the barn's lofts, away from prying eyes, administering the refined prototypes with a ritualistic precision, lancet to arm, a drop of the elixir, then observation veiled as counsel. Lyra was called again, her presence a cornerstone of his validations, her unyielding fortitude, the metric against which all others were measured. "This fortifies the line," Hawthorne said softly, his eyes avoiding hers as the needle pierced. Others followed. Silas, whose steps grew surer in the chill, young ones from the mandated unions, their innocence a stark counterpoint to the procedure's gravity. Responses varied like the wind's moods. Some bloomed with unnatural vigor, shrugging off the cold's bite, while others bore lingering resonances, as Hawthorne termed the fevers and doubts that followed. In his encrypted ledgers, Later unraveled by Elena Carter in a marathon decoding session at a Norfolk archive in late 2025, he wrestled with the fallout. The gift propagates, shielding yet scarring, a balance I tip toward the void. Jeremiah Blackthorne, from his vantage in the big house, tightened the noose of their pact with iron resolve. His daily rounds a patrol of preserved secrets. The alliance had borne fruit. Blackthorne's fields out-yielded rivals, whispers of their providential health circulating among elite gatherings without piercing the veil. In return, he deepened the silence, deploying overseers like sentinels to quash murmurs of the barn's burdens. One field hand, emboldened by the serum's subtle empowerment, dared voice questions during a communal meal, only to face isolation in the stocks, his punishment a stark emblem of the era's code. Jeremiah's inner sanctum, with its locked drawers hiding manifests of contributions, became a vault of complicity where he rationalized the cost in private soliloquies Elena pieced from charred fragments discovered in a 2024 excavation. "Progress demands tribute," one note read, "and ours is paid in endurance." His influence rippled outward, binding the local tapestry in shared denial, merchants tallying bales without noting the faint marks on labourers' skins, justices in county seats endorsing the estate's ledgers as unassailable truth. This institutional hush enveloped the region like fog over the lowlands, where official annals, those brittle tomes Elena combed through in dimly lit reading rooms, chronicled prosperity without the undercurrents of coercion. Virginia's early gazettes, scanned into vast digital vaults, extolled Blackthorne as a model of enlightened husbandry, erasing the human calculus that powered it. It was a betrayal etched in omission. Elites like Jeremiah, forging a legacy of selective memory, where the enslaved sacrifices dissolved into footnotes or flames. Yet persistence flickered in the oral embers, carried through generations in coded refrains and heirloom whispers, tales of the drawn fire that warded evil but exacted a soul's toll. Elena captured a poignant thread in a 2025 gathering with Lyra's descendants in a quiet Virginia parlor, an elder's voice trembling. "They took the sweat of our strongest, brewed it into shields for the world, but left us the thirst. We remembered, even when the papers forgot." The emotional currents swelled into a tragic symphony. Families in the quarters navigating the trial's wake with hearts heavy as harvested earth. Lyra's circle, bound by the plantation's mandates, felt the fractures widen. Children echoing their mother's caution in play, Theo's defiance simmering beneath compliant bows. The elder Mira, a pillar amid the flux, shared poultices laced with warnings, her songs a bridge to ancestral strength. These vignettes wove a melancholy resilience, lives compelled yet unbroken, their essences fueling Hawthorne's ascent while etching grief into the bloodline. Descendants, centuries removed, carried this inheritance like invisible scars, their quests for identity a quiet rebellion against the silence. Elena's odyssey intensified, mirroring the era's tensions as she bridged past and present. In a revelatory afternoon at the Virginia Historical Society in early 2025, she unearthed a concealed correspondence from Hawthorne to a northern patron, its seals broken but words searing. The prototype, from the field's deepest trials, attenuates fate itself, born of error, tempered by unyielding spirit. It illuminated the serum's covert journey, seeding vaccine precedents in anonymous treatises. Hypotheses crystallized. Had the final refinements demanded even greater intrusions, turning Blackthorne into a hidden forge of medical dawn. The 2018 Wells remains, subjected to advanced isotopic analysis, confirmed viral attenuations across multiple skeletons, evoking a concealed toll of experimental echoes. Hawthorne's marginal confessions hinted at fracture. The mistake redeems, yet damns Lyra's legacy, a chain I forged. As autumn deepened, Blackthorn teetered on revelation's edge, secrets straining against the harvest's close, the serum's promise casting elongated shadows over lives commodified for progress. Elena's unearthing accelerated, drawing the buried narrative toward light, where memory's persistence promised a belated reckoning for the forgotten. If this story has gripped you already, leave a like. This helps the story of Lyra reach more people. Winter's grip tightened on Blackthorn Plantation in the waning days of 1796, blanketing the fields in a merciless frost that silenced the last echoes of the harvest. Elias Hawthorne's laboratory stood as a frozen sentinel at the estate's edge, its windows fogged with the breath of culmination and collapse. The air inside hung heavy with the final distillations, vials of the perfected prototype serum arrayed like soldiers on parade, each a distilled legacy of Lyra's sweat, the stupid mistake that had attenuated death into deliverance. Hawthorne, gaunt from months of isolation, sealed the last crate with trembling hands, its contents bound for northern harbours under guises of trade goods. He had achieved what eluded the great minds of Europe, an early vaccine forged from unintended alchemy, a shield against smallpox drawn from the unyielding essence of the enslaved. Yet, as snow dusted the barn's roof, the doctor's reflection in a polished retort revealed a man hollowed by the cost, his scholarly fire dimmed to embers of regret. The pact with Jeremiah Blackthorn, once a bulwark, now felt like a noose, pulling him toward an abyss where progress and perdition intertwined. Lyra endured the season's bite in the cramped quarters, her body a vessel of quiet defiance amid the cold's encroachment. The plantation's shadowed programs had exacted their toll, compelling her into yet another cycle of creation. A newborn's wails, piercing the thin walls of her cabin, a fragile spark in the enforced lineage Jeremiah guarded like a sacred relic. These arrangements, rationalized as the estate's eternal sustenance, wove compulsion into the fabric of existence, turning intimate bonds into calculated inheritances of labor. Theo huddled close in the scant warmth, his arms a barrier against the wind, their family a mosaic of resilience pieced from shards of subjugation. The serum's invisible mark lingered in their midst, granting a spectral immunity that saw the quarters weather the winter fevers with fewer losses than neighboring lands. But victory came laced with loss. Lyra's steps carried a subtle weariness, as if Hawthorne's harvests had siphoned not merely her fluids, but the vitality that once fueled her songs. In the fire-lit evenings, she traced tales for her children, whispers of coastal freedoms lost, coded with warnings of those who took without consent, her voice a thread binding memory to the marrow. Hawthorne's concluding trials unfolded in the hearth's glow, a hushed finale that pushed the serum's boundaries to their frayed edges. He gathered the core survivors, Lyra, Silas, Mira, and a handful of others marked by the plantation's unsparing selections, for one last validation, administering the ultimate refinements in the barn's insulated alcove. The lancet's bite was swift. The elixir, a cool promise against the chill, but the aftermath stirred deeper currents. Some, like Silas, emerged fortified, their frames shrugging off the frost's grip with an almost defiant ease. Others, including a young mother from the compelled pairings, faded into quiet decline, their transitory echoes evolving into lasting shadows that the overseers dismissed as winter's whim. Hawthorne chronicled it all in his final ciphered tome, entries that Helena Carter would decrypt in a candlelit vigil at the Virginia State Library in late 2025. The prototype endures, a bulwark born of folly and fortitude, yet the donor's silence screams what words cannot. It was a confession veiled in science, the doctor's northern conscience fracturing under the weight of southern pragmatism, as shipments of the serum slipped away, seeding anonymous revolutions in medical thought. Jeremiah Blackthorne, from the insulated heights of his manor, enforced the pact's ironclad closure with a vigilance born of legacy. The alliance had secured Blackthorne's ascendancy, yields unmatched, health preserved, whispers of their miraculous fields elevating the family among Virginia's elite without unveiling the human forge beneath. In reciprocity, he orchestrated an unyielding hush, burning the last traces of Hawthorne's work in a bonfire under the winter moon. Ledgers reduced to ash, witnesses bound by threats of dispersal or worse. One final murmur from the quarters, a song laced with veiled protest, met swift retribution, a public admonition that echoed through the snow, reinforcing the silence that bound them all. Jeremiah's sanctum, its walls lined with ledgers of prosperity, hid the remnants. A single vial, perhaps, or a sketched formula, artifacts that would surface only in Elena's relentless pursuit. His rationale, gleaned from a surviving diary fragment unearthed in a 2025 family estate clearance, rang with cold clarity. The fields and the future demand their due. We pay in shadows, reaping light. His web extended to the community's fringes, where local elites, merchants, clergy, officials mirrored the erasure, their records a sanitized chronicle of abundance, blind to the coerced essences that powered it. This complicity formed a vast shroud over the era's truths, institutional betrayal woven into the very annals meant to safeguard history. Virginia's county archives, those faded volumes Elena traversed in exhaustive sweeps, extolled Blackthorne's model operations, omitting the veiled trials that birthed a medical cornerstone. It was a profound forgetting, orchestrated by those in power to preserve hierarchies, where the enslaved's contributions dissolved into ether, their stories relegated to flames or oblivion. Yet memory's embers glowed in the oral legacies. Resilient filaments passed through bloodlines in hushed gatherings and heirloom refrains, tales of the stolen fire that illuminated the world while dimming their own. Elena wove these into her tapestry during a poignant 2025 symposium in Richmond, where Lyra's great-great-grandchildren shared fragments, a locket etched with scars, songs that encoded the doctor's folly, voices affirming, "We gave the sweat that saved nations, but kept the soul that history couldn't claim." The human tragedy crested in these final, frost-bitten days, a melancholic requiem for lives commodified in progress's name. Lyra's family, entwined by the plantation's mandates, bore the serum's dual legacy, survival etched in their veins, yet shadowed by fractures of trust and autonomy. Theo's steadfast presence, Mira's whispered wisdom, the children's wide-eyed inheritance, all formed a quiet symphony of persistence amid erasure, their endurance a rebuke to the silence imposed. Descendants, scattered across generations, carried this weight like an unseen mantle, their quests for roots a faith-fueled defiance against institutional voids. Elena's encounters illuminated this persistence, her own journey, a bridge of late revelation. Archives yielding Hawthorne's full confession in a sealed envelope from 1797, discovered amid digitized ephemera. "The sweat of the damned birthed our salvation. Forgive me, for the cost was a soul." Prototype from Blackthorne's fields. Let no records follow. In the epilogue of Blackthorne's buried chronicle, we confront the interplay of memory and forgetting. A history where elites' betrayals buried atrocities under layers of denial, yet the enslaved's resilience ensured fragments endured in oral whispers and unearthed bones. The 2018 Wells skeletal guardians, with their attenuated scars, stand as tardy witnesses. Hawthorne's serum, refined through anonymous channels, influenced vaccine dawns that spared millions, its origins a silenced footnote to progress. Justice arrives late in Elena's revelations and descendants' voices, unmasking the cruelty, exploitation masked as enlightenment, complicity as the true chain. Faith in persistence, historians sifting ashes, families reclaiming narratives, pulls these truths from oblivion, honoring Lyra's unheralded gift and the souls it overshadowed. Blackthorn's shadows fade not into nothingness, but into light, a melancholic testament that what is forgotten can be reclaimed, if only we listen to the echoes. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Blackthorn Plantation. See you in the next video.